talk about. And also, as you've probably heard, we'd like to record the meeting just so that other people can be able to watch it. So like I was saying, grief and bereavement is sometimes a scary and uncomfortable topic to talk about. And so I'm really excited that we have Alicia and Dina and Barbara here to kind of give us some inside scoops from their expertise to share with us. Since we are such a small group, what I'd like to do is, as we're I'm presenting some questions to our panelists, if you have a question, you could either put it in the chat, then we can follow up afterward, or we can do a Q&A at the very end. Okay. Just have to go back to there. Right. So let's kind of start with Alicia. Let me phrase it just right here. How do you prevent against burnout? Because I know your field, there's a lot of death going on. And so how do you kind of prevent that for your own?
One of the biggest things I think of is to definitely process it yourself. Make sure that you have somebody in your life that you could talk through things. So, and be able to cry. I'm a crier. And so I definitely am not afraid. I used to be afraid of crying. I used to hate crying in front of people. And so I definitely encourage like people to take the time that they need to grieve. Because even like you get attached to people, like, you know, that's part of human nature, is being attached to those you come in contact with. So if you're in contact with them for a week or a year, you know, you still get attached. And so you need to, even though it's your career to be part of these people's lives, like you have to give yourself time to get over it. And then also like self-care. One of the two things I love to do is exercise and plan vacations. And so COVID has ruined my vacation planning for the moment, but I'm definitely starting to get back on that. But that's something that I do to take care of myself and kind of embrace every journey and adventure that I get to go on, and know that there's people who never got to do those. You know, take advantage of what you have, and don't take anything for granted, because you don't know if tomorrow's actually going to be here.
Thanks, Alicia. Hi, Tracy. Glad you can join us. So we're
so sorry I'm late.
How do you prevent burnout in the field of expertise? That's okay.
It cut out, right, sorry. So Ella's joining me.
Hi, Ella. So let's start with Dina, and then Barbara, and then Tracy. If you wouldn't kind of answer the question, how do you prevent burnout in your field?
I'm going to tag on to what Alicia said, that having people in your life that you can talk to, particularly whether that's a single individual, whether that's a professional counselor, or someone who's not a family member. When you're grieving, it's really important to have someone who is not a family member that you're able to process with. So having people around you that will check in with you, see how you're doing, that's really important. And the other piece of self-care. You can't help someone else if you're empty. That's the old, oxygen mask before you help somebody else with their mask on. Whatever it is that you enjoy doing. It's for me, I enjoy music. And of course, much like a lot of people, singing has been, for all intents and purposes, silenced because of COVID. We're just now getting back to being able to do some singing. So I'm able to engage in my hobby. The other part of avoiding burnout is to be aware of what your body's telling you. there can be moments where your body is sending you clues, having that self-awareness. A couple of years ago, I started having some really severe heart palpitations, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. And what was happening was my body was trying to send me a signal. Hey, you've been doing too much. You've been pushing for too long. You need to take care of yourself. But it took those physical symptoms to be able to get my attention, to be able to do the self-care that I needed to manage that condition. And this, anytime you're working in this kind of a field where there's a lot of stress, to be able to do that self-care and listen to yourself. And it's not selfish to take the time that you need to take a break, to rest, to get a massage, to go exercise, whatever it might be that you enjoy doing. Take that time. If you have to, set an appointment for yourself in your calendar. And so that that time is just as important as the time that you would spend with anybody else.
Okay, so I'll go next. I worked at Elder Health and Living, which is a memory care community, for many years, and was a family services coordinator. So I actually worked alongside caregivers, staff, and I led support groups for the family members. And in my work with both of them, I talked about being prepared to be caught by surprise, because especially with the senior population and those with memory loss, you're going along and you're kind of doing maybe a steady decline, and then suddenly you're dropping because either the person can't let you know that things are worse or even where they're worse, or they don't want you to know because then they might not get to be at what they consider to be home. And so that's really important to just have that in the back of your mind that might happen. And I experienced that personally with my mom. Then another thing is to really get ready. Have the decisions so matter of fact in your mind. You know them all. You have everything ready to go so that you can stay in the emotional, grieving, transitional part of the journey. And then that's less stressful because you've done what you could do. And I guess the last thing is, I'll go along with the others. I always recommended that people have someone who absolutely has their back, that if they tell you plan A is over, what does plan B look like? You will accept that and move on and make that agreement ahead of time. And I made certain that everyone in my support groups had that lined up ahead of time so that, again, you have that self-care.
Okay, I think I'm next, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I think you guys all know a little bit about me already. I've been a special ed teacher for a long time. So number one, I can't talk about work outside of work because it's all confidential. So one thing that in grad school, we took a teacher's class, how to be a teacher or something. It was ran by our advisor, and she reiterated, number one, because of our line of work, nothing leaves the school building ever. You finish work at work. If you have to set an alarm for yourself or you pick a day that you stay late, then that's what you do. And then the rest of the days, you go home at a certain time. And that's how you have to do it, because you can't super talk about work outside of work. I talk about my students with my family, but they all have nicknames, so nobody knows who anybody is, unless they've gone to class with me, like my son's gone once or twice. Then they kind of figure it out. But and so that's number one. I don't have my email on my phone, especially after being online and literally attached to a computer. This is the third time I've opened my laptop since like the 8th of June, since last day we were in the classroom, because I have to have that cutoff, and I have to have that separation 100% of this is work and this is home. And if I miss out on a meet, I didn't know there was a meeting at 8 a.m., a stand-up meeting. Well, you know what? Don't send it an email. Send it in a text if it's that important. Because I'm not checking my email at home unless it's a directive kind of thing. Because that's my time with my family. I really try when the school year is over, I'm done, I'm out. I don't go back to the school building unless I have to, 100%, because my kids miss 9 months of me. And so they get these 3 months with me. And my other thing is definitely once a month, probably on payday, I will take, if I can. When I was working in Eugene, it was awesome. My prep period and like that last hour of the day, I'm getting a massage. I have to get a massage. That is, I can fall asleep, I can put my headphones in, I make everything go away. And while I'm getting that massage, because your mind just seems to wander, I have since January been imagining my wedding, what it'll be like when I walk down the aisle in October, or anything else to keep my mind off of, oh my gosh, I have this amount of paperwork done and I need to get grades done, and this awfulness happened, and oh my gosh, is this kid, the holidays are coming, is this kid going to be able to eat, or whatever. I have to separate it. So I imagine my kids on Christmas morning, or something else to put me in another place to make sure my mind does not loop back to school.
Thanks, Tracy. So we heard boundaries, self-care, massages. I think everybody's kind of said massages. I think that's a great idea. So the next question is, what are some qualities you believe you possess that are necessary when working in this sector? So grief and bereavement, kind of that. So what are some qualities that you have that you feel like you possess that you've been able to contribute to that profession? And we'll just kind of go the same way. So we'll have Alicia, Dina, Barbara, and Tracy.
It's better if I turn on my microphone. I think a lot of stuff is, besides like compassion and empathy, like definitely empathy, but being able to listen. Like you have to truly be able to listen and be able to meet people where they are, because everybody's grief is going to be different. Some people are going to shut up their walls. Some people are going to push you out. Some people are going to literally cry on your shoulder. And you have to be able to meet them where they are. Some people will just stare at you, and some people will talk 100 miles a minute. And being able to, however you're involved in their process, be where they are, so that way you can understand what they're going through and not what you think they should be going through.
And the other piece of that I think of as you're talking, Alicia, is to be willing to be in the messiness of grief, and to know that your job is not to fix them. There's nothing wrong with them because they're grieving and they're expressing whatever emotions they're expressing. There's not a wrong way to grieve, unless it's going to hurt themselves or someone else. I often encourage people to say that it's, if it's not illegal or immoral, or it's not going to hurt someone else, yourself or someone else, then go for it. So you need to be able to be in that space with them, and set your own biases aside. And, recognize that, we all have biases. We all have things that we carry in with us. But it's not about me. It's about that person that I'm with in that moment. And to be able to be present with them in that moment. I think the other piece of it is, again, I talk about self-awareness a lot. To be self-aware of when you're in a situation where you're you have something that's being triggered, something from your own grief experience, and to know when is, okay, you know what, I can't be with this person. This is too close to my own story. It's too close to my own situation. I need to give this to someone else, and be able to pull those person or people into that situation to provide someone that care, knowing, you know, where your spots are that are just a little too close for comfort.
In my work, I always started with trying to find the blessings first. Because in every situation, even end of life, there are blessings along the way, and to try to help the family look for those. And just kind of an aside for all of you, you're really in a great place, because the professional community here in especially Lane County, I found that they always played nicely together. And so that no matter what you needed help with, you could maybe not find the person directly, but you could find someone who would help you find that person. And I really liked that. There's a professionals group that still meets monthly for seniors. And we used to have a group called Partners to Improve End of Life Care, which I think did a lot of good things for our community. And then at the end of it, I try to be grateful and help the family be grateful. Because even if maybe things didn't go the way they thought they would or hoped they would, or, you know, they didn't have the end of life with everybody sitting around and having a lovely evening like they really imagined, maybe they learned some lessons along the way about how they want their own end of life journey to go. There's always some good to come out of it. So trying to help people find that perspective was one of my favorite things to do.
I think definitely recognizing the stages of grief, working with adolescents, they're going to be angry. They're not going to understand what's going on, and how to process it. They don't have that frontal cortex like functioning yet all the way, you know, plugged in. And so really understanding those stages of grief, and working with them through that, and letting them know that, hey, I think one super advantage I have is they all know I was a nurse in the Navy. So there's that huge portion of my life that they've like seen or experienced, and even if it's Black Ops, because a lot of them play Black Ops, or whatever, hey, Call of Duty, that they know I've already seen it real life. So this is a safe space. You want to yell, you want to get it out, you want to disbelieve, you know. I don't have the advantage of giving them the spiritual aspect of it. So I always try and use the term higher power that they use in like a lot of the anonymous programs, AA or NA or Depression Anonymous or something, and really let them know that this is just, it's a safe space. You know, my especially after school hours, or, you know, passing period or my prep, or lunch in the classrooms next door empty, and just let them have that moment there, and that I'm available if they need me. So.
Great. Thank you. All right. So this question is specifically for Dina and Barbara. I'm just going to change things around a little bit. All right. So in your opinion, do you believe families and individuals benefit from counseling, grief counseling? And if so, can you kind of share your thoughts? And whoever wants to go first.
Okay, I'll go ahead and go first. Absolutely, they benefit from grief counseling. Grief counseling is really the foundation of a lot of different forms of counseling, because we all will experience grief and loss at some point in our lives. so families tend to process grief in different ways. Each person's going to process differently, and whatever their family system is, whatever it was as they live their lives, it's going to show up in spades when they get into a grieving situation, especially if this person was somebody who was foundational in their lives and very central to the family. If there were issues and cracks showing up before, they're really going to be magnified in this situation. So to have someone be able to, who's not emotionally connected to the family, for that individual to be able to hear the story from one or multiple people within the family, be able to validate the grieving process for each individual, and then be able to give them tools and different ways that they can work together to be able to, for all of them to find grief and healing and, to move forward in their lives makes a really big difference. And again, just not, like I mentioned earlier, that you want to have somebody who's not a family member to process with. So to be able to have someone who understands their grief and who can listen to them, and validate that it's really okay that they're not leaning on their, husband or sibling or parent or whomever, that's really important.
I think if you look at the different types of grief, you'll see how important it is to have counselors involved. So if someone starts the anticipatory grieving at time of diagnosis, we'll use Alzheimer's because I'm very familiar with that. So you start grieving little bits as you go along. And a lot of folks thought that when the person passed, they were done grieving and they would just sort of move on. And then 2 years later, when their brother passed, they would be immobilized because they really didn't grieve the first loss. So then they're into this abnormal type of grief, which really needs some professional treatment, I believe. And I, trying not to ignore the elephant that's in everyone's living room right now, I believe we'll have that with COVID because people aren't getting to do proper visiting, proper rituals. Everyone's excited about getting back to normal. Yet those the people who have lost loved ones are nowhere near that. Then there's other people who, like in our situation, have an immunocompromised person and nothing's normal. If anything, our losses are greater right now. Our separation is bigger, which then goes into this disenfranchised grief, which is when you're not really talking about it publicly. So there are many people in our world that have no idea what our daily lives are like. They know we've been vaccinated. They think everything's just fine. And to cheer them on because their world has opened up a bit, and to kind of protect ourselves, we're not talking about it all the time. We don't want the judgment, the questions. The people that need to know. So you have people that are hiding the fact that they're grieving. And that takes professional approach, I think, in a big way. I can help families do what, there's a doctor, Dr. Ira Byock, who did palliative care. And he wanted everyone to get to, forgive me, I forgive you, thank you, I love you, goodbye, before end of life. Now, I made that a goal to try to help families get there in whatever way I could support them. But that's far different than what you are all learning in your counseling education. And I respect that and I'm grateful for that.
Thanks, Dana and Barbara.
Mm-hmm.
Alicia and Tracy, what's one thing that you wish you could have known before you've experienced grief and bereavement in your field?
I don't know if you guys have ever read Gone from Our Sight. It is an amazing book. And it really helps you go through the process of the dying process. I was actually in hospice for 1.5 years before I read that book. And I recommend it to everybody because it really does. It helps with the anticipatory grief, because especially for people who are processors and want to know every little bit of what's going on, it gives you a lot of information. The other thing, I don't know if most of you know, I don't know if you know this, Laura, but I'm also a nurse, and I've worked with Jasper Mountain and Jasper Mountain Safe Center for 4 years now. And so there's a lot of grief that goes on there too, because the grief that the kids deal with in losing families, they go through grief just as much, because especially those who have lost adoptions, they've had their parents taken away from them. And so we go through with those kids a lot of the same stuff you deal with in like the death process, because like these parents are basically dead to them. They've like all contact has been shut off. Usually at the fault of the kids who are blowing out, and the parents can't deal with it. So it's a struggle. And that's one thing, is like to really be able to recognize that grieving process and all of the different stages of grief for a loss of a relationship like that, a parental relationship, or like, you know, a partner that just up and is gone, is the same grief and the same heartbreak and the same loss as a death, especially a death that is sudden.
Who's the author of that book? Do you know?
Dina? If you actually, I have one right here.
If she doesn't find hers, I've got it on the shelf.
Yeah, I know. Mine's not far from here. I probably could find it pretty
It's
quick.
a little
But there it is.
pamphlet.
Yeah, it's little.
Yeah. Barbara Karen's RN.
Okay.
But I love this thing.
Mhm.
Barbara, you've read it?
Absolutely, a few times.
I feel uneducated because it is not in the teaching world. Sorry.
If you ever go through like a death, dying thing, you're gonna want to, you'll want it.
Okay.
But yeah, I actually, part of my job is orienting new nurses to the hospice house, and so I make sure everybody gets one of these when they first come in, because it's amazing information, and the poem that's in it is amazing.
Okay, mommy's turn. Sorry, I have kids. 100% in the teaching world, teaching bigs, because I don't teach, I've never taught littles, I've always taught bigs, high school. If it's a death from medical reason, then it's fairly expected. Otherwise, it is 100% sudden and unexpected. There is no forewarning. And so just, I wish I would have known how better to handle sudden deaths from the beginning of my teaching career. I kind of knew from the military aspect, but that's, you know, they're already in the military. They're already like, they're going to suck it up. Like, kind of like, I don't remember your name. Barbara was saying, with the COVID aspect, right? Like, you don't show it, you suck it up, you just move on, you know, you're happy for the people, and really working with because we're all battle buddies, so we all have a partner, and if that partner lived and the one died, that's where you really have to just do that. Remember, you have to go back out there tomorrow if your injuries aren't that bad and you're back on the front line. And so that doesn't have the same aspect, obviously, as school. And so just really being able to understand adolescence processing and the full stages of grief when I was first teaching, and to have a student shot in a drive-by. I'm from Oregon. I'm from Roseburg. That doesn't happen in Roseburg. So to be in inner city Las Vegas, that was like, oh my gosh, how do I help these students? I've had a couple of and continue, because as their teacher, I continue on, especially with bigs, in their lives after they graduate. And so to have a cheerleader die from COVID this year, and be far away from Las Vegas, and to try and help support that, or shot in a drive-by at Eugene, we had a student commit suicide. There was several students up until I think this last round of graduation went to school with the cheerleader that died in a sneaker wave on the coast. And so the deaths that we experience are sudden and tragic and very, like, there was no preparation for it. This last year within my school, I had a student who was in the special ed program that didn't get a heart transplant in time and passed. And so that obviously was a very long, drawn out. I'm probably similar to what Barbara definitely deals with the old timers, with the elders with Alzheimer's. But just to know that they're so young, I mean, they're 16, most of them 16, 17. It's a shock, and to try and be there as that safe space. So really how to process. I wish I knew better when it first happened, how to process adolescent grief, because ours is sudden. You don't know it's coming.
As a parent, you want to know that too.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, because they're going to come, they're going to come home and, oh my gosh. So, or they're going to read it on social media, and you may not know. I mean, depending on the relationship you have with your child, like one of you were saying you were at the house where the kids and bad things, or frustrating, not appropriate choices, things.
Yeah.
And so those kids, when they do experience that grief, they're probably not going to open up right away and just, okay, I have a Pandora's box of what? So.
Thanks, Tracy. That was kind of like my next question, kind of what we were missing. And so it sounds like more education kind of in that grief.
Sorry.
Especially with adolescents. No, it was perfect. Yeah. It tied right in. So I'm opening this up to all the panelists. What in the grief and bereavement section, what is missing that we should know as counselors? So you're letting us know. And then you can start.
Can you say that again? It cut out on my end. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. So what in the grief bereavement sector are we missing?
I think we're actually missing, people are still afraid to talk about it, and which is hard. Like people are afraid to talk about like when they die, like what's happening. Sorry. But yeah, I still think it's that thing. People are afraid to talk. It's easier to just shut down and not talk about it than to actually bring out the emotions. Some people would rather feel physical pain than emotional pain. And I definitely think then that's the hard thing, is like, and it comes back to working with kids, and I'm sure Tracy sees this, like you have kids who are cutters and kids who are, would much rather bite themselves and hit themselves than to feel pain. And it's trying to like understand and realize that it's okay to feel pain, and it's okay to cry, and it's okay to show your emotions. But I think that's what missing. Like we still have like that tough guy image that we have to hold up. And we do at the hospice house, we do a walkout, like everybody who's in the house does a walkout with people who, when they've passed. And I was a mess one day. It was so hard watching. Just some days I'm a mess during the walkouts, and I turn around and I'm like, gosh, I just wish I would stop crying sometimes. And my manager looked at me and she's like, Alicia, when you stop crying, it's time to move on, because it means you've stopped having the heart to be here.
Mm.
I'm thinking that about the culture. Our Western culture in particular, is very non-understanding of grief and bereavement. You know, you get 3 days off of work if you're lucky. And so even beyond the talking about grief and making it okay for people to talk about grief, is to be the advocate, to be an advocate for talking about grief and bereavement, and validating that process is expected, and that it's not something that needs to be feared or needs to be somehow pathologized. That, you know, that there's not something wrong with someone when they're grieving, and sometimes there's this idea of, okay, well, we're just going to, you know, prescribe them a medication and put them away. So really, as counselors, to be able to really validate people's experiences, but to really be advocates for yourselves and your own grief process, and also for the people that you serve. Don't be afraid to speak up when you're seeing something that just doesn't feel quite right to you, particularly in this realm.
You know, in the support groups I would help lead for the Alzheimer's Association, when we get a new person, I would right away go to, you know, you don't have to just come when your person is alive, but if you choose to continue to come after they pass, that's great. And there's quite a few people here who are still coming, and we welcome you. And then as their journey went along and I'd see that maybe they were getting close, I would remind them of that. And then after they had been coming 6 months after their person passed, I would give them permission to stop coming, because maybe they just needed to hear that it would be okay if they stopped also. Some never stopped. And some never came back. As soon as the person died, that was it. They were done with support group. But we had that lovely mixture, which helped in the ways that support groups do. But I think also what's missing is prior to death, an understanding not of what the choices are, but what they look like. That book that you have gone from my site is great in very calmly and clearly explaining things, physical things that happen. A lot of people, like you said, don't want to talk about it. They can't. Well, in my family, I gathered them one time. We filled out all the papers and then went away, but we didn't really talk. So then 5 years passed and I realized I had it all wrong, even though I worked in the field. And our daughter said, oh, so you're going to make us talk about death again? And I said, well, can we at least agree that we never actually talked about it? And can we also please agree that we have it all wrong? You play banker in Monopoly. You should be the power of attorney. Our son at the time didn't open his own mail. He does now. He shouldn't have been a power of attorney because he probably wouldn't have opened my mail. But he was here and he cared about me and supported my choices and would make a great healthcare representative. So we had it completely backwards. You pick the daughter, the firstborn, to be your healthcare rep, but that's not always right. And on the post form, you know, you have these choices, but if you're not in the field, maybe you don't know what they look like. Maybe you have a grieving son who's yelling at the family caregiver because there's no feeding tube happening. You know, why are you not doing a feeding tube? Well, I got a very clear signature here that she didn't want one. And that conversation happened in front of a doctor. Oh, so you're just going to starve her. Well, no, her body's shutting down. It'll likely be more painful to feed her. She's choosing not to eat because her body's telling her not to eat. It's those things that interfere with the grief process. And all that could be dodged if we would have real conversations ahead of time. There's an organization called the conversationproject.org, and it's really worth a look. And the conversationproject.org. And the latest numbers I saw were that 92% of people said it's important to have these conversations, but only 32% have had them. Where does that leave anybody? You're dealing with all these distractions instead of doing proper grieving. So get ready.
I would say on the adolescent side or any youth side, having, knowing that a lot of these kids, especially if you go into school counseling or adolescent counseling, they need a trusted adult. If you're in school counseling, know that you're going to have a bunch of kids, you're going to know all their names and you're going to know their faces, but you're also going to need to be able to rely on the other staff at your school to be that like sounding board on that kid. There are so many kids that don't have a single trusted adult in their life, not one. And that goes for the entire LGBTQ community, as well as anybody that is experiencing grief. So many of our kids have had some form of grief or bereavement in their life. It may not be instant, but trauma lives are huge in our adolescence. And I think it's going to explode as we return back to school this fall, because all of those eyes that have been on those kids, littles to bigs, and those homes that were like, there's some really bad things happening at this house, and we've called and for mandatory reporters, but we weren't able to, our hands were tied over this past year, unfortunately. And so that's really going to amp up. So understanding they need a trusted adult in their life. Doesn't have to be you. It definitely doesn't have to be a parent, but a trusted adult. And then also a safe space. A lot of them, if they have a room, a lot of them, the only safe space in their life might be their bed. And even then, that's not a safe space all the time, especially if we're talking about, some awful things happening in that space itself at home. And so a lot of teachers, I know that we have signs for our classrooms for the LGBTQ kids, students, as this is a safe space, but all students need to know that I don't care what orientation, or color. I mean, if you're fluorescent neon pink, yay, please come to my room. This is a safe space, and you can trust me to know that I have your best interest. And so stop. Hey, it was an accident. And so understanding that a safe space and a trusted adult, that's wow. If we could have that for everybody, which is so sad that our kids, not all of them, they're born with two, but they don't even have that. And it breaks my heart all the time.
This is some great things, especially starting the conversation. People don't talk about grief usually until it happens. And then sometimes it's too late because they don't know how to act, they don't know how to behave, they don't know who to turn to. So my last question to all the panelists again is if you wouldn't mind kind of sharing your experience, maybe your roughest experience and how you dealt with it. Keep in mind the confidentiality, so share as much as you can. And just kind of how you dealt with that. Like maybe it was your first experience in your job. Maybe somebody died there. That was your first experience. So just kind of share with us kind of. Whoever wants to go first.
It's hard to pick out a single experience. Gosh, there's a couple. I think the hardest are the people who group by yelling at and the blame. I think, well, so I get the hardest experience was the first time I ever gave morphine to it wasn't the first time I gave morphine to somebody, but it was the first time somebody died within 10 minutes of me giving morphine to them. I know I didn't kill them, but the wife looked at me and what did you do? Get out of my house. So I'm still trying. This is when I did home hospice. I was at her house. He had a pain crisis. He couldn't breathe. He told me to help him. Like his eyes were telling me he needed help. And so, we talked to the meds. I'd been there for over an hour. And, that one final dose did cause him to pass away. And just the look in her face and trying to process it. Luckily, I had somebody to talk to. So I picked up the phone and I called her. And I'm like, help me get through this. And she actually came out. She was a social worker on call at the time. Came out and helped us actually both process it together. That by far was the hardest thing to do. But I think one of the hardest things that I see now, which is in a completely different way, and it's kind of that same thing of trauma, dealing with trauma, and people who are trying to with like the counseling and stuff, and helping people process their own traumas as kids or as teenagers or whatever. If you don't process your traumas and try to get through them, deaths are at the end of life, your body and your mind are trying to deal with your trauma. And so then you start to say things and and families are like, what's going on? And so it's hard. So if you haven't dealt with traumas and stuff in your life, the end of life process, the grieving process, is just a little bit harder. So, and sometimes the spiritual care people, that's sometimes the end of life, you're doing nothing but helping these people deal with all these things that they did or didn't do that they're regretting, and now it's coming back at them. And you've got a 54-year-old who's trying to make amends with all their kids because she had pushed them away, and now she's holding on even though her body is saying don't. She's holding on until she gets to make those amends, and that's part of that conversation too. Don't be afraid to talk, even if you do something stupid, don't be afraid to find somebody to help you work through it, because it's better to do it sooner than later.
Dina, if it's okay, I would like to go next, because what I was going to say really piggybacks well on this. Is that all right?
Go for it.
One of our most challenging situations was an elderly man who lived in the same home as my mother, and he was clearly dying and had been alone, and used to talk about his years past and some of the he'd hint at bad stuff that he did. And he just wasn't at peace. He wasn't comfortable. He was fidgety. You could see that there was something like you're talking about. And so we got creative, and it took us a while to figure it out. We really had to go outside the box. So the care manager of the home put on a lab coat and put a pulse monitor on his finger and told him he was having a lie detector test. And she'd ask him basic questions and he'd answer his name and blah, blah, blah. Anyways, that started him feeling better. And then I called a pastor and I said, I need you here today, please. And he said, but I don't look like a pastor and I know your rule. I have a baseball cap on. I said, I don't care. I'm breaking my own rule. Please come. And please talk about forgiveness. Just go there. Well, turns out this guy probably did do some bad stuff. But when he was done with the pastor, and I had to stay in the room, I couldn't hear, but I had to be present because of all the rules. And by the time the pastor left, his body was so calm. I thought, okay, that's what we needed. So it's just trying to figure out what's missing. Why is the person hanging on? And he died within hours, but he was calm. So yeah, it's tricky and hard and challenging, but so worth it for everyone. Yours, Dina.
Probably the hardest situation that I faced was, how do you be the bereavement coordinator when your own mother is dying? And Alicia was right there with me through that too, so she knows, my story. But my mom was diagnosed with cancer unexpectedly in the fall of 2019, and from the time of her diagnosis, I went into anticipatory grief. I mean, incredible grief from the very start. I grieved hard and grieved deeply. Well, in the meantime, we still have people coming into to work, and we have people dying, and we have, all these different pieces, and then COVID, of course, had to make things more complicated. But I think that was the hardest thing to face. I have all this education and all this training in grief. And my dad had died on hospice about, well, let's see, it was in 2015. So, a few years prior. But how do you be how do you care for other people when you yourself are in the midst of grieving yourself? And learning that it was okay to let other people take those whatever needed to happen in that moment, to be able to delegate that, and that it was okay to take care of myself. That's really, I think, the self-care piece that I gained a lot of traction in, was knowing that it was okay for me to step away and have my own grief process. And that's also where it really continued to cement the whole idea of knowing where your grief triggers are. Because there were several months after she died that I could not work with anyone who'd had their mother die. I couldn't do it. It was just too difficult. And so as a counselor, knowing that I was allowed to be a daughter. I was allowed to be my mom's caregiver, her daughter, because I had people around me who took wonderful care of my mom. She was at the hospice house at the end, and she had incredible people who stepped in and were advocates for her, and also took care of me. And so to have that knowledge that, okay, so how in the world do I do this? Well, you know what? It was impossible. In the midst of everything, it was impossible to be able to do my job. And that was okay. That was where it was okay to let other people pick that up for a period of time. And so, if you have something in your life, it doesn't have to be the death of a parent, but, for me, that was just a real big learning, and probably one of the most difficult situations that I faced in the last couple of years, to be able to keep any kind of balance. And I had one of the social workers who actually continued to work with me for a year. She got me through the anniversary, and we just recently have finally ended that relationship, a professional relationship of grief support. So that's my thoughts when I think about, one of the most difficult things. How do you balance the two?
And probably everyone was watching you do it too.
Actually, that's very true. And I had people that told me